Hello, everybody. Welcome to Room and Board. I'm Zachary Groombridge, and this is the Rule Book Club. It's the book club for people who want to talk about tabletop role-playing games and rule books. And this month, we're talking about Apocalypse World. Apocalypse World is a game that I like a lot. I'm probably going to gush about it. I'm going to try my best to describe to you why I like it and why you might be interested in it. But I don't think I'm going to do as good a job expressing how cool this book is than the author of this book does in writing the book. You should just read Apocalypse World because it's a lovely read. I love Apocalypse World. I think it's a great game. I think it's a very smart system. I feel like it had a really big impact on the tabletop role-playing game community. It might have had a smaller impact than my impressions told me it did, because I don't think it really affected people who are really into the sort of Dungeons and Dragons side of tabletop role-playing games. And I think that that impact is lessening as we move further and further away from its debut. But there's a whole catalog of games that use the Powered by the Apocalypse World system, including Monster Hearts, Night Witches, Dungeon World, super popular, super successful games, some of them very niche, some of them doing some very interesting things. But they all have their roots in Apocalypse World. And there's a whole ton of games in like a second or third wave, I guess you might say, that are taking inspiration from Apocalypse World to make new games. So I think it's a good idea to have Apocalypse World in a book club about tabletop role-playing games. So what is Apocalypse World, and why are we talking about it this month? Well, Apocalypse World is a tabletop role-playing game about role-playing in the post-apocalypse, Mad Max, Book of Eli, deserts, wastelands, big cars, flames, guitars, drugs, machine guns. It's an apocalypse tabletop role-playing game. One apocalypse, every apocalypse. It's so cool. The apocalypses are cool. Reading the Apocalypse World rulebook, it fires me up to tell stories and to think about apocalypses in general. I was all fired up to consume any kind of post-apocalyptic media I could. And I think that's a sign of a well-written game. I think that's our preamble done. Let's move on to our first pillar of review, the conversation. I think that all tabletop role-playing games are at their heart. They're a conversation between the players at the table, between the players and the GM, between you and yourself, between you and your sort of imagination. And I think that without realizing it, I think the origin of that idea, the reason that pillar number one is that we talk about conversation on this show, I think is because of Apocalypse World. And I only realized it rereading Apocalypse World, because I opened up the book and I read the first paragraph. It was a flavor text. Read the second paragraph. It's sort of an introduction to the game. Read the third paragraph, and it's just arguing, hey, tabletop role-playing games are conversations. And I was reading that, and I was like, I bet that reading Apocalypse World at some point in the past, it planted the seed of the idea that all games are at their hearts conversations in my head. And that seed sprouted when I started making this show, and I did not realize where the seed came from. And I found it. It's the Apocalypse World system. So that's where that idea came from. And I think unsurprisingly, in the game that gave me the idea to make my first pillar about conversation, the game cares so much about the kind of conversation you have at the table. It cares about how you talk about characters, about place, about time. It cares about how you think about using the rules of this game. It cares about whether or not you think about the rules at all. I think if you took the rulebook for Apocalypse World and you ripped out every page that talks about the conversation that is the game, I don't think you would have a rulebook left. I think you'd rip every single page out of this book, because every page in this book is first and foremost concerned with creating the foundation for really interesting conversation. And the rules aren't secondary to that. The rules and mechanics in Apocalypse World are so tied into the kind of conversation Apocalypse World wants to create around the table. I think I'm going to have some trouble describing that conversation to you without just gurgitating everything in the rule book. I think that's a good thing, and I think it's a bad thing. I think it's going to make it very hard for me to summarize my thoughts here, but I'll start out by saying you should just read Apocalypse World. If you have a passing interest in storytelling or in tabletop role playing games or storytelling games or just thinking about fiction at all, I think Apocalypse World is full of jazz that will give you fuel. So what is the conversation that Apocalypse World wants to create around the table? It wants everyone around the table to be engaged at all times. And it doesn't want everyone around the table to be engaged with a tactical combat situation. It doesn't want everyone to be engaged with the rules. It doesn't want everyone to be engaged with looking towards the game master and asking for clarifications. Apocalypse World wants everybody to be living imaginatively within the fiction of their apocalypse world. It wants you to be thinking constantly about what your character wants, what they're doing, where they're going, what is active, what tactics are they applying in what situations in order to get what they want? How are they interacting with other players? Something I had a real issue with in last month's game, Mythic, was that the whole game was about asking yes or no questions. And I think a yes or no question is kind of boring. Once you phrase a yes or no question, you've sort of presupposed both possibilities, right? Is there a castle on the hill? Well, either there is or there is not. It's kind of a dead question as soon as I ask it, right? And Apocalypse World is not interested in answering yes or no questions. Apocalypse World as a system is interested in asking questions of the players, of the game master, of the people around the table, and supercharging their imaginative engines in order to try to find answers to those questions. And I think that is just so much more interesting than what sort of Mythic was heading out to do. I think one of the issues with Mythic was very early on in that rule book, it it talked about, hey, this is a storytelling algorithm. This is an artificial intelligence. This is a system for constructing a world around you. This is a way that you can export your decision making process. And I think that's kind of uninteresting, sort of imaginatively. And Apocalypse World is the exact opposite. Instead of exporting your responsibility for making choices, Apocalypse World is about pushing you into circumstances where you make a lot of choices, where you have to make lots of decisions, where you surprise yourself because of the quantity of creativity you have to output. I know there's a thing that people say in comedy or stand up or improv where they say that, like, when you run out of your material, when you run out of your pre-planned thoughts and you're reaching into the bottom of the barrel and you're coming up with stuff that you haven't presupposed, that's when the real magic happens. That's when the real comedy happens. That's when real improv sort of sparks to life. And because Apocalypse World as a game system is constantly asking you as players and the game master to invent and create and to answer questions, and the questions never stop, and you're always pressed to create answers or search for answers or struggle against the questions. It's constantly asking you to dip into your own well of imagination and draw something forth. And where a game like Mythic sought to surprise you by sort of exporting your decision making process, Apocalypse World surprises you by challenging you to surprise yourself, and you will surprise yourself. You will feel like a genius playing Apocalypse World, and I think it's all down to a really clever design. I'm talking generally right now because this is the section where we talk about what kind of conversation this game creates. It's creating this conversation that I'm describing to you by using very clever mechanics that we'll talk about in the next pillar. But yeah, so Apocalypse World is really solely interested in you, the players, the people around the table, engaging with the fiction, the make-believe world that you're imagining that your characters reside in, the apocalypse world. And every mechanic and rule and system, every principle, every agenda, they all work together in this game to sort of drive focus towards that imaginative play. There's lots of games out there that sort of straddle the line between game and storytelling engine. And I think a lot of the reason for that is when you're playing a tabletop role playing game once a week, once every other week, what have you, and you're getting together with your friends, that day you're playing role playing games is a day you're not getting together to play board games or video games or what have you. And so because it's taking the place of your game night, a lot of tabletop role playing games really go game heavy, give you lots of systems, lots of mechanics to dig into, lots of character creation stuff, lots of tactical combat, because it's going to have to sort of play the dual role of story game and sort of complex game night game. There's other games that lean really heavily into the storytelling aspect, and some of those games that lean really heavy into storytelling lack for a little bit of longevity, right? Because you're a gaming group, you want to get together and game. And I think Apocalypse World leans a little bit more to the storytelling side, but there is a game there. And now that we're sort of talking about games, we'll see if I can edit this together in a way that makes sense. I hope it can. Let's move to our second pillar of discussion, the mechanics. The mechanics in Apocalypse World are so clever. Let's start with talking about the basic move in Apocalypse World. And I said earlier when we were talking about conversation that Apocalypse World is like really laser focused on getting everyone around the table to be thinking imaginatively about the fiction, about the imaginary world that the characters and the players in the world exists in. The root of a lot of that focus comes down to the core mechanic in this game, which is called moves. Essentially, a move is made of two parts. First, it's sort of a narrative trigger, a fictional trigger, and the second are sort of like the mechanical implications. So what do I mean by a narrative trigger? In Apocalypse World, you never say, I would like to attack that character. What dice do I roll? You never say, I would like to seduce that character. What dice do I roll? You describe yourself attacking that character. And the act of describing yourself attacking that character triggers a move, right? It has a fictional trigger. You describe yourself seducing that NPC, and the act of describing seducing the NPC triggers the move. You never just say, I want to seduce. You describe yourself seducing, and then someone else around the table, maybe it's the GM, maybe it's another player, says, oh, it sounds like you're triggering this seduce move. I think I'm trying to remember the wording of the rule. I read this book digitally. I don't have a physical copy of Apocalypse World. So normally I would just check. But I don't remember the wording of it. I think the wording of it in Apocalypse World is, if you want to do it, do it. If you want to do it, do it. If you want to seduce that character, don't tell me you would like to use the seduce move. Seduce the character. And so, yeah, all the moves begin with a narrative trigger. When you strike a character, when you gaze into the psychic maelstrom, when you do X, the move triggers. And in order to trigger the move, you need to engage with the fiction. You need to talk about how your character is doing the thing. And what this creates around the table is a situation where I'm describing what my character is doing because I want to achieve something. I want to go and seduce that character. So I'm describing what my character is doing. But in describing what my character is doing with the intent of going and seducing that character, I might accidentally describe myself doing something that triggers another move in the game. And someone else around the table will perk up and say, it sounds like you're going aggro. It sounds like you're staring into the psychic maelstrom. And the answer is always, yeah, no, I guess that is what I described doing. So the game is sort of encouraging you to think about the fiction and engage with the fiction and talk about it. But in talking about it, you stumble into using rules that you maybe didn't intend to use. There's another great side effect to the move system in that when I'm describing something that my character is doing, it could trigger someone else's move around the table. I'm describing myself sneaking across the courtyard to go to seduce the bouncer in front of the apocalypse bar. And in describing my actions there, I might trigger a move that some other character has on their character class sheet, or it might trigger one of the moves in the middle of the board. And so what this creates is a situation where everyone around the table is constantly paying rapt attention to everybody else around the table. The conversation becomes electric because when I'm describing what I'm doing, it has implications for everyone else. right? I want to go and get into the bar, so I'm going to go seduce the bouncer. So I'm going to describe myself going over there to just seduce the bouncer. There are stakes in this for everyone because everyone else around the table wants to do something. And when they describe what they want to do, they're going to have to bounce off of my description. And my description might trigger one of their moves, and my description might inadvertently trigger a move I didn't intend to activate. And so these fictional triggers create a situation where everybody is intensely focused on what everybody else is talking about. And that focus is not on the mechanics of the game. That focus is not on sort of stat checks and grappling rules and who gets to talk when and what's the DC of this. The focus is on this sort of imaginary play space. And I think that's super cool. See, here's the thing. Apocalypse World is a really engaging system that I think you really only understand when you see it in practice. But we'll move on. So yes, every move begins with a fictional trigger. The other thing every move has is a mechanical consequence. And you roll a bunch of dice in Apocalypse World, but there's something so elegant about the dice system here. Every time you roll dice, every time you've triggered a move by describing a thing, you roll 2d6. And on a 10 and up, it's a hit. You get what you wanted. I do seduce that bouncer. On a 7 to 9, I get a hit. I get what I wanted. I seduce the bouncer, but there's a cost, there's a complication, there's an unexpected revelation. And on a 6 or lower on that 2d6 roll, I don't get what I want. And the game master gets full authority to tell me what happens next. And I am not going to like it. So there's not a binary here. There's not a yes or no here. I want to go seduce that bouncer. I'm going to do a thing to attempt to seduce that bouncer. It triggers the move to seduce the bouncer. I roll some dice, and the answer is not whether or not I seduce the bouncer. The answer the dice is giving me is what kind of situation is created by me attempting to seduce the bouncer. That move is going to ask me another question that is going to give me another reason to pursue something further. So engaging with these moves drives the story forward, and it never dead ends. It's so good. It's so good. The other thing I think is brilliant about the move system in Apocalypse World is that because the way every player around the board, including the game master, engages with the game is through the moves. That's the only mechanical avenue to engage with the system, with players, with the world itself, is to engage with these moves. First, everyone is talking about the sort of fiction of the story. But also, if you're the kind of player that plays games super selfishly, you want to be a power game. You want to do what's best for your own character. You want to go into that bar so that you can get paid, so that you can do whatever. You want to power game this game. You're going to have to describe yourself in the fiction, engaging with the story. The results, the mechanical results of the move are going to push me, that power gaming player, into more interesting situations where I'm going to need to, in order to get what I want, engage with the system, listen to other players, talk to other players, be invested in what they're doing. But if I am not a power gaming player, if I'm here just to create a fun story with my friends, if I'm not here to win, I'm engaging with the same mechanic. In order to make a good story, am going to go and seduce the bouncer at the Apocalypse Bar because I think that's going to cause the most chaos, create the most interesting story. I'm not going to be able to seduce this guard probably, but it's going to create something interesting when I roll these dice and engage with this move. All of these different kinds of players are sort of funneled into using the same system that creates good story by design, that creates excellent conversation by design. One of the key parts of a good conversation is listening to each other. And the way the structure of the moves and mechanics in Apocalypse World work, it creates players around a table who want to listen to each other, right? It creates people who want to pay attention to what is being described. I think it's great. Let's roll back here for a second, talk about sort of the general mechanical structure of the game. So we've discussed the moves, but like, what are classes like? What are characters like? Every player gets a little playbook that has a number of special moves associated with them that are attached just to that character. And using those moves, you get to express your individuality. But then there are general moves, I think maybe 11 moves in total, that go in the middle of the table that everybody has access to, that aren't attached to classes. And those are the general moves. And those are all the rules you need to play this game. Slap the 3 pages of general moves onto the middle of the table, hand everyone a playbook, a class playbook, and everyone can play immediately with zero preparation. It doesn't matter if you've never played this game before. Hand out those 6 pieces of paper and you have a game immediately. And everybody understands it almost immediately after the first couple moves, after the first couple actions. I think that's so clever. I think that's so slick about this game. So besides moves on the player side, there are moves on the game master side as well. And the only difference between the moves that players have and the moves that the game master has is that the moves that the game master has don't require any dice rolls. And the game master only activates those moves. And this is so indicative of the way this game works. So the rules for the game master are as follows. Whenever a player around the table turns to the game master to see what happens next, the game master makes a move. Whenever a lull in the conversation comes up, the game master makes a move. The game master has a list of, I think, 12 different moves of things that they can make happen in the game, such as divide the party, deal damage to someone, take something away, warn of future badness, reveal something terrible. And so whenever a player makes a move and rolls a 6 or lower or a 7 to 9, the game master is going to make a move. Whenever a player is describing a thing that's going on and then doesn't know what to say next or needs to know information about their environment and turns towards the game master, that's when the game master makes a move. And in play, it works so well because it means that the game is always sort of sparkling with life. None of the moves that the game master can make are sort of passive. Everything the game master can do mechanically either calls to action, warns of future badness. It creates something for the players to sort of interact or to work against or to prepare contingencies for. Yeah, so the whole system becomes a flow of back and forth of players describing what they're doing in the world, their descriptions triggering moves, those moves triggering dice rolls, those dice rolls creating situations, and when those situations come up and players don't know how to respond, the game master steps in and makes a move, and then in response to that move, the players start to describe what they do again. It triggers moves. This is the cycle. This is like the conversation wheel of Apocalypse World. And it's just so charged with energy, with intent, with doing things with creativity. I could go into all of the details about all the different moves players have and sort of all the minutia of, what options are the players mechanically given on a 7 to 9 on this move when players are rolling to take control of a situation. These are the options they're given on a hit, and these are the options they're given on a miss, etc. I'm not going to go into all that minutia because I'd just be I'd be reiterating everything in the rulebook. It is everything there is so sort of tactile and immediately interesting. Every time you roll dice and look at the rules, those rules are going to pose more questions. Those questions are going to drive further play. That play is going to drive the conversation. That conversation is going to drive the game master to make moves. Those moves are going to drive players to seek out ways to fix them. It's just really excellent. Let's put the moves aside. They're great. The mechanics in this game, they're sort of sparkling with life and energy. There is not in Dungeon World a complex, complicated combat mini game, right? There isn't a tactical skirmish game buried inside of Apocalypse World because it's a storytelling game and it knows it's a storytelling game. There isn't a really super in-depth sort of economy under the hood where with money and barter and stuff like that. There is an economy. It's very simple. It's very boiled down and it supports play, but there's not a lot of depth there. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of this game mechanically, in that I think a campaign of 5 to 6 sessions is probably where you're going to max out on it. There's going to come a point where the story is going to remain engaging. The mechanics are going to be driving an interesting narrative, but the wonderful magic trick of the apocalypse world is going to wear off eventually. And when it starts to wear off, when you start to see the seams and see how this sort of finely tuned little clockwork mechanism of storytelling works, it's going to eventually leave you sort of maybe wishing for a little something extra. And I think that's where, if you look at games that are coming out nowadays that are drawing or harkening back to what Apocalypse World did, and games like Apocalypse World did, a lot of those games are adding additional systems, right? They're adding downtime mechanics. They're adding tactical combat mini games inside of the basic structure of powered by the Apocalypse systems. They're borrowing a lot of the way the moves work, right? And I think adding more sort of like gritty mechanical game systems to the way Apocalypse World works, sort of, it will give it more longevity. That's what sort of more modern games do. That's what I understand. I haven't read it yet. Games like Band of Blades do, right? They add sort of more gritty mechanical systems under the hood. So that's, I think, is a weakness of the Apocalypse World system, is that I think it's got a shorter campaign shelf life, but I think that's also good. I think that's also exciting, right? Because while I think it has less staying power than some other tabletop role-playing games, it gets to the really good stuff really fast, which also makes it really good for one-shots and things like that. The simpleness of a lot of the systems, the intuitiveness of a lot of these systems, the interconnectedness between these moves really makes it a great game to sort of whip out at conventions, to whip out for one-shots, to whip out for like short campaigns. Yeah, there are a ton of rules in Apocalypse World just for the game master. There's whole chapters on it, just talking to the game master about what the game master's agendas are. Like, what are they after? What is their goal, overarching goals in running a game of Apocalypse World? And there's chapters about the principles that a game master in Apocalypse World should follow. The sort of guiding principles that sort of should drive all of the game master's intent. Those chapters are so insightful and so good. They give you like hard and fast rules about game mastering that I wish so many other games did. I think no matter who you are, we're dipping into our last pillar a little bit. How should you use this game? I think play this game, right? We'll jump there right now. Go to our last pillar. How should you use this game? I think you should play Apocalypse World, or a game that uses the powered by the Apocalypse World system at some point, if you're interested in tabletop role-playing games. But at the very least, if you're interested in storytelling, if you're interested in tabletop role-playing games anyway, if you're interested in Dungeons and Dragons, I think there's an incredible amount of value in reading the rule book for Apocalypse World, because it's going to tell you, it's so chock full of good advice about how to be a good game master, how to be a good player, how to be a good storyteller, how to write interesting stories, how to think about characters in engaging ways, and some real hard and fast like methodology, rules for how you should think and act and respond, right? One of my big issues with Mythic last month was the Mythic role-playing game system. It kept saying over and over again, hey, when the rules here in Mythic aren't working out, just use logic. Use logic to figure out what happens next. And one of my issues with that was like, what does that mean, right? Like, we all are always thinking logically all the time. And it's incredibly unhelpful for a game about storytelling to turn to you and say, hey, if you want to tell a story, why don't you just think about it? It's a useless bit of advice. And if I look at Apocalypse World, here I have most of the rulebook, most of the like 200-page rulebook is direct advice, direct instructions on the logic that you could apply to thinking about stories generally, and role-playing games specifically, and Apocalypse World particularly. It gives you the logical framework to work from to be creative. And I love that. I love that in Apocalypse World. I think it's gold in print. Another thing that you should use this book for is there's a ton of stuff, a ton of little mechanics in Apocalypse World besides the instructions on how to play uh, role playing games generally, or as a game master. There's a ton of instructions on or a ton of little rule systems that you should pluck out of Apocalypse World and apply to all your other tabletop role playing games. Here's a mechanic I love. So it's an apocalyptic tabletop role playing game. There's this awesome system called Doomsday clocks. So when the game master warns the players of something, like an impending black miasmic cloud rolling over the horizon, and it's been growing darker for 4 days, they put on a piece of paper in front of view of all the other players a little circle, a little clock face, and they divide that clock face into a number of wedges. And at any point in the game, when someone rolls, someone fails a roll, instead of doing damage to that player or aggressively sort of changing the game state, the game master can come in and fill in a wedge of that doomsday clock, and the countdown to doom begins. Oh, we're 6 hours from midnight. We're 3 hours from midnight. We're 2 hours from midnight. We're half an hour from midnight. And when midnight arrives, that's when the doom comes to pass. And so, over the course of a game of Apocalypse World, a campaign, the piece of paper in the middle of the table with doomsday clocks on it is going to get populated, and those clocks are going to start to count down. Yes, there's the boiling cloud of miasma rolling in from the eastern horizon, and that doomsday clock is at 11 o'clock. But there's also the doomsday clock for the cannibal tribes on the burn flats, and that doomsday clock is at 9:30. And there's also a doomsday clock for the crazy chopper gang that's driving monstrous hell-spawn motorbikes, and they're coming in from the salt flats, and they have horrible demons behind them, so the demon motorcycle gang is coming in from the south, and that's another countdown clock, and it's almost at 6 o'clock. All of these countdown clocks are chugging towards doomsday, and not all of these doomsday clocks can be stopped. Some of them can certainly be stopped. Players can see, okay, we can go and deal with the gang of demon motorcycle chopper riders coming from the south, and they could go on an adventure and do something to stop, delete that doomsday clock, prevent that little mini apocalypse within the apocalypse from coming to pass. But every time they devote time or energy to stopping or halting the progression of a doomsday clock, the other doomsday clocks are going to irrevocably count down to midnight. You're spinning plates in Apocalypse World, and it feels absolutely fantastic because no matter what the players are doing, and what they choose to do and what they choose to ignore or what they're forced to ignore, no matter what happens, the players are changing the status quo of the world, right? You stop the demon chopper gang, but the miasmic cloud rolls in and eliminates color from the world. You stop you run away perhaps from the miasmic cloud coming in from the east, but you can't do anything against the cannibal tribes to the north, and they eat the entire settlement, right? No matter what happens, the choices of the players become incredibly impactful because when they succeed, they've changed the world, and where they fail, they changed the world, and there's no way to spin all of the plates in Apocalypse World. And the game master should just keep handing plates out. It's so exciting and so good, and you should steal doomsday clocks for every every tabletop role-playing game you ever play, because they have such an immediate, exciting, electric effect on the story. End of my fourth pillar: you should read Apocalypse World and steal heavily from it if you're going to play another role-playing game. You should read Apocalypse World if you're interested in just apocalyptica, right? Apocalypse storytelling. You should read it if you're just interested in telling good stories, because there is food for thought in Apocalypse World. It's a good game, but we've missed one pillar of our review. Let's go to the setting. What does Apocalypse World offer? It's a rule book with a setting in it. There's not a whole lot of sort of descriptive text or sort of setting information in Apocalypse World, but there are these really brief, incredibly evocative little sort of bits of flavor text. At the beginning of every sort of playbook, each class in the game, there's a little like one paragraph in-universe description of what that kind of class is, and it is so evocative and so full of calls to action that I've never read the little blurb at the beginning of a character class and not immediately wanted to play that class, right? It gets you. The person writing this game, really knows how to write in a really sort of down to earth, grab you by the heart kind of way, but also they just know how to fill every little bit of prose with sort of a call to action, an entreaty to you, the player, to engage with it, to do with it, to grab the ball and continue the run towards the touchdown. And I think that's super wonderful. When the author goes into descriptions of how to play the game, they're talking in a very conversational, down to earth sort of way with you, the player, or with you, the reader. And it's very readable, but it also feels so evocative of the kind of apocalypse that the author is trying to get across. I don't know how to describe that feeling, but like the enthusiasm the author has for the subject material of the game sort of crackles off even the most dry rules explanations. And I think part of that is because the rules are so interested in interesting you in the world, right? In the circumstances of the characters, in the way these systems work, and how specifically those systems drive you to be creative in sort of an apocalyptic setting. The only real facts that you know going into an apocalypse world game is that there is a psychic maelstrom, a sort of metaphysical psychic storm at the edge of reality that's either caused by the apocalypse or that caused the apocalypse, and no one really knows for sure. And beyond that, the apocalypse can be almost anything you sort of dream up. I want to take a moment here while we're talking about setting to talk about not Apocalypse World, because I think Apocalypse World does the apocalypse thing super well. I think a game that uses this rule system, but that really does the most it possibly can with setting is another game that uses the powered by the apocalypse system. It's called Monster Hearts. And I want to talk about Monster Hearts here because I don't think I'm ever going to do a video about Monster Hearts, but the way Monster Hearts uses the same rule set and bends it to a different setting is really exciting. You'll see this in every game that sort of uses the powered by the apocalypse system to varying degrees of success, right? They all take these systems and try to create principles and agendas, tailor moves that sort of create the setting that particular game is going for. Monster Hearts is a game about teenage monsters in high school. So, vampires on the cheerleader team, a Sasquatch nerd, a Buffy the Vampire Slayer cheerleader. It's about monsters in school. And something I think is so clever, and it's present in Apocalypse World as well, but I'm picking up Monster Hearts specifically because I think it's so well done, is in Monster Hearts, all of the classes are a kind of monster. So you're playing the werewolf, or you're playing the Sasquatch, or you're playing the vampire, or you're playing the Kelpie. And all of these sort of monsters have a bunch of moves that make them monstrous. The werewolf always knows where his date is because he can always smell it. The Sasquatch goes unnoticed in every room that they're in. The vampire can mind control people that they have a conversation with. But something that's so excellent about this is there's a double meaning behind that. Yes, the players in Monster Hearts are explicitly playing monsters, but they're also just playing high school students, right? And all of the monstrous traits they have can be interpreted as just being the traits of high school students. The vampire could be explicitly mind controlling people, but maybe it's also just a manipulative high school student. Yeah, the Sasquatch has a power to go unnoticed in every room they're in, but maybe they're just a awkward, hairy teen that's hit puberty and no one really pays attention to them. Yes, the werewolf has a super ability that allows them to always know where their girlfriend is and whether their girlfriend is talking to another boy, but maybe that's just a really jealous teenager, right? and so there's this wonderful sort of dichotomy. The way the playbooks are written are feeding into the high school drama aspect of that game. They're also feeding into the monster of the week sort of aspect of that game, and there's a balancing act between them. The general moves in Monster Hearts are so good because all of the mechanized moves that players have access to in Monster Hearts, they're all they're all really unhealthy options, right? If you're the Sasquatch and you are failing your math exam and you want to pass your math exam or else your parents are going to get angry at you, and you turn to the rules and try to figure out what rule are you going to leverage in order to not what move are you going to try to activate in order to pass your exam, you only have the ability to seduce or to lash out in violence or to be incredibly mean or to go off into a corner and write bad poetry. And all of these are unhealthy choices, right? Going on punching your teacher in order to get an A in a class that your parents don't get mad at you is an incredibly unhealthy choice. But as players level up in Monster Hearts, they get to add new general moves to their own playbook that are things like talk it out with someone, explain your feelings, listen to another person, right? They start to get healthy adult moves as opposed to the unhealthy teenager moves that everyone starts with. And over the course of a game of Monster Hearts, as people level up, they become less and less monstrous. They become less and less stupid teens. They become more and more sort of well-centered adults, right? Um, and that's all just sort of built into the rules of the game from the ground up, and it's all done really simply and really intuitively with these moves, with these narrative triggers, with these moves that drive certain questions and demand that players answer them in specific ways. I think, yeah. So in Monster Hearts specifically, I think the capacity of the Apocalypse World system to tell stories and create setting by driving the conversation around the table through mechanics is so evident and clear and so excellent. And it's no less excellent in Apocalypse World. I think Apocalypse World is just doing things in a little bit more subtle ways than Monster Hearts, which has sort of this bold-faced uh, teen monster growing up, trying to reach adulthood sort of theme pasted onto it. And it's very clear for me to describe what's going on in Monster Hearts, and it's less clear to describe what's going on in Apocalypse World. But both great systems, right? Both full of setting, right, without being full of flavor text or lore. Apocalypse World is chock full of sort of evocativeness. I dare anyone to read through the Apocalypse World rulebook and not be intensely excited to go and tell apocalypse stories, to go and tell stories about driving their busted up war wagon over the black asphalt of a burnt universe and doing battle with a bunch of machine gun toting mohawk babes on the right. It's cool and it's very good. I love the setting in Apocalypse World. I love the setting specifically, I think, because of the ways the setting sort of asks all the players to help create it, asks everyone around the table to invest themselves in creating exciting elements to it. The player's interest in the mechanics and systems of Apocalypse World drives them to explore the Apocalypse World, right? And the all the players' interest in doing interesting things in that world makes that world interesting through the use of the moves, right? There's a wonderful sort of rolling synergy in an Apocalypse World game. Man, I like this game. I like this game a lot, and I think that if you sat down and you wanted to use this game to tell uh, to play a tabletop role playing game solo, I think you could do it. I think you could do it better than you could with Mythic, right? And I think specifically it's because Apocalypse World is constantly asking you questions, you the player, you the game master, questions. And the way you answer those questions is you engage with the systems of the game. You might be daunted by the amount of sort of choices the game asks you to make, but I don't think you should be afraid of making choices, of stretching your imaginative muscles up in your head. I will end our little discussion of Apocalypse World with a little story. I remember in my last year of university in an acting course, we had one class. I think it was in improv, and the teacher came in and they put a water bottle in the middle of the room, and the whole acting class is sitting around the room, and we're all looking at this water bottle in the middle of the room, and the teacher says, "Look at this water bottle and recreate it in your head. Right? Understand this water bottle in its entirety, its shape, its color, the way light bounces off it, the way light passes through the water inside it. Think about its weight, think about its shape, think about its dimensions. Imagine this water bottle." And the entire class sat there in silence for, it felt like almost an hour, just looking at the water bottle and trying to see it, right? Trying to stretch our imaginations to imagine the water bottle that's in front of us. And I think towards the end of that class, the teacher just asked us to try to imagine that water bottle that we were looking at floating, and like literally trying to like imagine the water bottle that we had been sort of holding in our mind's eye, and imagine that water bottle lifting off the floor. And I could swear that at the end of that hour, I saw that water bottle float a few inches off the floor. It didn't, right? Like this was not like a religious experience. This was not about us developing super psychic powers. But like for a couple of instants, I fooled myself. I believed that water bottle was hovering, right? I believed it absolutely. Everybody's capacity to imagine stuff and to surprise ourselves and to fool ourselves with our imaginations is like lovely, is exciting. One of the things I love about Apocalypse World is it's always asking you to stretch your imagination, to dig a little deeper, to reach out a little farther, to surprise yourself. Like open your mind to that apocalyptic psychic maelstrom and see what reaches back and touches you. And I think that's part of why I so disliked Mythic last month, right? Because that was a game that specifically didn't ask you to stretch your imaginative muscles, right? It asked you to, when the moment to make a decision, to use your imagination came up, to step back and to use its yes or no system. So I would say don't be afraid of your imagination. That's part of why we're in this hobby together. Part of what makes it fun and exciting. Yeah. So those are my thoughts on Apocalypse World. Let's talk about next month. I think we're going to be reading and discussing the RPG called Trophy next month. Someone mentioned that in the comments a couple videos ago. I put it on my list. I was looking at that list and saying, hey, what jumps out and says it's interesting to me? And Trophy jumped out at me. So I think we're going to do that. And after that, month after next, I think what we're going to do is Chris keeps getting sent emails from companies with samples of upcoming tabletop role-playing games, and he keeps sending all of those PDFs to me, and I haven't really read any of them, but I'm going to go through them, and we'll see which ones I can speak about, because I think some of them are on like a do not talk list yet, or have not officially been released. But with the ones I can talk about, I think we'll do a mega episode, and I'll read a bunch of them, and we'll just sort of rapid fire them and give you my impressions, and we'll see if that's fun. Yeah. So next month, Trophy, and after that, we'll do a Bonanza fire sale episode of the Rulebook Club, and yeah. Thanks for joining me this month, all 250 of you guys. I hope to see you next month. Feel free to mention anything you want to talk about in the comments, and I will try to engage with that conversation. Have a great one. Cheers.